Hey, this is Mark Henry, author of Dancing with Energy, Healing, Magic, and Mysticism, here to bring you more information on the occult and paranormal. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about something that's exciting to me, but I'm also a little wary to talk about it because it has a little bit of a negative doom connotation to it. So let's get started. So the topic for today is going to be about who are your spiritual oppressors. And we're going to be talking a little bit about spiritual parasites. We're going to review the information I've done in previous videos on the Jinn. And then finally, new information on the Archons. So here we go. First, I want to start by saying that if you're like me, I like to think of me being in control of my life. You know, I have free will. I make choices to direct the course of my life. And while I realize that there are other influences like society, there are social influences, systems revolving around family, and that sort of thing, I generally like to think of myself as the master of my own fate. Now, when we're talking about this particular subject, now we are broadening things to talk about influences that most people aren't aware, and if true, changes the whole game. So, first, to start the topic, I want to get you to entertain the possibility that we live in a predatory universe. If you think of ourselves, we consume food, we consume drink, we even consume each other in the sense of intercourse, sharing bodies, sharing energy. So we are consumers. So we do this along with other species in the animal kingdom. So if this is true, who is to say that there are not other predators that we cannot see, potentially consuming us? So let's get into the who. First, and I've spoken about this before in other videos, I'll term them the spiritual parasites. These are not very sophisticated spirit beings. They're not very intelligent, yet they have sentience, and what they do is they come and they attach to our aura. What is attracting them? What generally attracts them is our humanity, our humanness, our frailty, our woundedness, when we get really angry, anxious, depressed, especially about some deep-seated conflict, things from childhood. It is very attractive to these spirits. And they come, they attach, and they feed off of it. I've even known people who have called upon out in the universe, hey, I need someone to help me with this particular thing, and one of these spirits come along and they attach and they implant some thoughts in their head to give them enough something to try to move forward with their problem, and then what they do is person becomes used to it and they keep feeding off of them. So, like I said, these aren't very sophisticated spirit beings. Sometimes they are conceptualized or seen by clairvoyants as having tentacles like octopus, and some see like squid-like creatures. Not very attractive, but that's how they're often appear. They feed on the more negatively vibrational emotions, even I mentioned anger, anxiety, fear, all that, and lust, especially they can feed off of energy during intercourse or masturbation or any other type of major release. The major releases is what they're attracted to, because that's what they use to nourish themselves. And long term, you don't want these things on you because, one, you get used to them, and they can actually implant thoughts in your consciousness to make you more angry, more anxious, to which they can feed. So it's this weird relationship that we have with them. So there's them. Next, time to talk a little bit about the Jinn. So to refresh your memory, the Jinn are the pre-Islamic or even Islamic entities, spirit beings that are said to be born of smokeless fire. They were cast from the heavens by Allah for not obeying His will, and if I remember correctly, not subjecting themselves to Adam. Jinn, as a spirit species, have free will. That was one of the things that they acquired when they were cast out. So they have the ability to do as they wish. I am not sure whether they follow any particular dictates from the higher Jinn or not, but they don't send a... I don't get the impression they necessarily have to follow divine law, which makes them very rogue type of spirits, very unpredictable and potentially dangerous. They are also shapeshifters, so they can appear to be various things to us. They can also traverse dimensions very quickly, so they can come in and out of our reality very rapidly. And I've had people who have spoken to me on Facebook and on this channel who believe that they've been influenced and even possessed by Jinn, and that is part of the tradition, Muslim tradition of the Jinn spirit, is that Jinn are capable of possessing you and implanting thoughts in your mind. And even having a kind of a negative, like a negative effect on you. Some paranormal researchers, like I mentioned in another video, believe that some expressions of the paranormal, like maybe the shadow people or the black-eyed children, are manifestations of Jinn because of their commonalities. Black-eyed children, the shadow people just come in and out of nowhere. They just show up, and they tend to, especially the black-eyed children and the shadow people, they will appear and they will really frighten people. And as part of that fright, it is surmised that they can nourish themselves off that energy, just like we were talking just now about this general spiritual parasites. So that is the Jinn. Now to the new stuff. We're going to talk about the Archons. So the term Archon comes from Gnosticism. Gnosticism predated Christianity, and it even at one point kind of melded with Christianity to Gnostic Christianity. But when we're talking about with Gnosticism, gnosis, from knowledge, gnosum, knowing. When the occult and the magic community talk about their own personal gnosis, they're talking about their intuitive, the knowledge they've gained through intuitive and methods of looking within to gather knowledge. So it is kind of a connection there. So the Gnostic texts were supposedly written around 1600 years ago. They were discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945 in a sealed container. And in these the sealed container, they had writings. The one they had the most complete writings of was the Gospel of Thomas, and they've had other ones, Gospel of Philip, and these are very, very loosely Christian. They're more spiritual. They're more looking within to find your own salvation and finding your own enlightenment, which the Gnosticism system and the Gnostics were a big threat to the Christian religion as it was coming up, and many of the Gnostics were killed outright. But I don't want to get too far off into that, but I want to kind of set the tone for this whole Archon idea. So, creation myth goes something like this. There is the divine, and yet the divine did not create our material reality. Our material reality was created by the demiurge, which means like a half-god. Archons are almost serve the demiurge. You can think of the demiurge as kind of like, I guess, the chief archon. Created our physical reality. And also, by the way, this explains the problem of the theological problem that has been in Christianity for a while. It's more of a philosophical problem. How can an omnipotent, omniscient, perfect God create something imperfect as in man? Well, this myth is saying that, well, God did not create man, a lesser being, an imperfect being itself created man, and that's why we are the way we are. So, the demiurge created us. So you can blame, according to Gnosticism, the demiurge for all of our flaws and supposed faults. So, the demiurge created us, and the Archons are kind of like those that keep track of us and guard us. Think of them as our prison guards. In Gnosticism, our earth, our reality, is considered a very negative place where a lot of uncertainty and a lot of problems occur. And we could agree with that to a large degree. And yet the Archons are what keeps us in place. How do they keep us in place? Well, one is that the Archons themselves, Archon meaning ruler or authority, that they are the masters of deception. I believe that somewhere in the Gnostic writings refer to them as the masters of mimicry, or something along those lines. They're not creative like us because that's part of divinity. So what they can do is they can invert, they can create illusions, they can change things to make it seem that it's not the way it is. Some people who look at the world and the state of the world in our society and say, okay, look at the Archons. What's up is, what's really up is peers down and everywhere in between. Now, some writers, like David Icke and John Kreider, believe that these Archon can actually feed off of us, just like the other types that I mentioned. Now, I don't believe that that is in the actual Gnostic writings. But that's more of a New Age concept, the feeding. But I'm not willing to say that that's not true. It could very well be true. Other things about the Archons. Again, that they're here to spiritually oppress us, possibly feed on us. They are here to keep us from, I guess you could say, spiritually elevating. So when you find yourself trying very hard in life, and you account for the fact, when you do account for your flaws and even social influences, and you feel that, hey, I should be further along than I am, Gnostics would probably say, that is the Archon trying to keep you from reaching enlightenment. So there's more to say about Archons, but I don't want to spend too much time. So I talked about Archons, the general spiritual parasites, and the Jinn. So given that we have all of these beings, and by the way, I'm not asking you to believe any of this. You must do your research, go into meditation, find out for yourself whether you decide this is true. Sometimes, if I'm not sure what something is true or not, what I'll try to do is to try on the idea and say, okay, let's say Archons and the Jinn and all this exist. I'll pretend for a little bit that they are. What can I possibly do to protect myself or do something about it? Because it's almost like one of those, you don't want to make too big of an error by not realize, if it's true, I mean, if it is true and you're wrong, you're at a greater loss in a way than if you say, I don't know if I believe you're true, but let's say I'll take some steps to guard against it. Kind of like this. I've never had somebody in the middle of the night open my door and walk into my house. I've never had anybody that I know have somebody walk into the middle of their house in the middle of the night. But yet I am going to lock the door just in case somebody decided that somebody did decide to do that with bad intentions. So, the same sort of deal. So let me tell you some ideas from other writers about how to possibly deal with this situation. Okay, first, we go to the Gnostics, what they believe. They believe that despite all being created by the demiurge and being guarded by the Archon, that we have a divine spark within us that can never be extinguished. Despite being imprisoned in the world of matter, we still have the divine within us. And that is why in Gnosticism they talk about looking within and finding the divinity within yourself. It always exists. So with that spark, the Gnostics believe that by meditation on the divine, on getting to know yourself, maybe even acknowledging that this is a reality. By doing those types of things, you will elevate yourself to become more in tune with the divine and reach the divine. And by doing that, then you break the shackles of the Archon. So that is one solution. Now, if you look at authors like John Crider, who wrote Overcoming the Archon with Alchemy, he believes that some spiritual exercises similar to Qigong are necessary to deal with this particular situation, because you're not going to destroy the Archon, you're not going to get rid of the Jinn, you're not going to somehow eradicate the spiritual parasites I mentioned in the beginning. So what you have to do is kind of deal with the symptoms. So let's say that these beings are taking your energy. So what you need to do is you need to learn how to bring more energy in. And he talks about spiritual exercises bringing more energy into you from the environment. If you were to think of the energy around the environment kind of like blood, you'd be like a vampire, and you'd be using the energy to bring it in. That which is just hanging out there, universal energy. He also talks about in his book, once you bring in that energy, creating a barrier around yourself. And you, of course, by doing some particular meditations and practice, you create a barrier where once the energy is in, you can contain it. Because it doesn't do any good if you're bringing energy in and you go into a state of mind and then the energy is extracted from these beings. And from there, he goes into actually, projecting energy to kind of change your life using focus and will and some of the things that it's common themes in magic. So that's kind of his way of kind of dealing with the symptoms of the Archon. And I imagine that he would say that if we had enough people do these types of things, that we wouldn't be able to have an influence of the Archon. So. Well, that is about it. I've been talking for a long time, 20 minutes. So let me know what you think about Archons, Jinn, spiritual parasites, those things that could possibly make things much harder for us in this reality. Alrighty, well, I will talk to you later. Please subscribe and like. If you have any comments, again, put them in the bottom. Put a couple links down there in the description. See you later, and y'all have a good weekend.